go ahead and let's start talking about our infrastructure and what are some of the things that we need to consider in regards to upgrading it. So first things first, we're going to be talking about our search engine. So if you're coming from the Liferay 6.2 world, you know that by default, the default search engine in 6.2 is going to be Lucene. Now transitioning over into the Liferay DXP world, we're using Elasticsearch. It comes as an embedded service. So for the most part, for non-production, for testing and development purposes, it's enough. But once we hit that production world, the embedded Elasticsearch is not supported anymore. So if we're going from 6.2 to DXP and we've been using the defaults all along, then we don't have a lot of things to worry about. If you're coming from default Lucene in 6.2 into DXP, you can continue using the embedded Elasticsearch, again, for your development purposes, for your testing purposes. Once you hit production, you're going to have to do some configuration to get Elasticsearch on its own in a standalone or remote environment. So let's first off consider a couple of different options. Where we're going into the production world, right, we're going to want to put Elasticsearch in its own standalone or remote environment. So there's two different approaches we can take. If you got some hardware to spare, if you have your spare machine or box in the closet, you can use that. One of the advantages there is you're going to have a huge performance boost because all of your dedicated resources for Elasticsearch is, well, dedicated to just that. So you're going to get a big boost in performance, right? It's going to be sort of the preferred. So you take your Elasticsearch server, put it on a remote server somewhere else, and then point Liferay to it. Now, maybe we're a little bit more budget conscious, right? We don't have that spare machine in our closet. What we can do instead is we can spin up another Elasticsearch server on our own machine, but spin it up in its own separate JVM. So that way it's kind of like it's on its own, but in reality, right, it's still on the same box, but it's not the one that's tied to Liferay. So two options, you have your standalone server, or you can spin up a brand new Elasticsearch server on your machine that's running Liferay. And we'll take a look at that pretty soon. So non-production, again, it's very straightforward. As you're going from 6.2 to DXP, all you really need to do is re-index. That's pretty much it. Elasticsearch is already configured. We don't really have to think about any sort of configuration. Again, this is assuming that we are in a non-production world. So re-indexing is pretty straightforward. If you want to do this yourself, feel free to navigate around. But again, you don't have to if you don't want to. So all you need to do is head over to your control panel. Under the configuration section, you're going to find another section called search. Over in that search section, you're going to find a button that says execute that lines up with a header or a heading called reindex all search indexes or indexes. So click that button, Liferay reindexes everything, and boom, you're pretty much there. So that's again, non-production. Let's say we are in the production world though. So there's going to be a couple steps we need to follow in order to get our Elasticsearch working in the production world. First part is we're going to need to install Elasticsearch as its own standalone process, either in its own server, own computer, own machine, or on your own machine here, whatever the case is. Next up, you're going to have to do a little bit of configuration, right? You can give your Elasticsearch server a name, and you can also configure an Elasticsearch cluster. Next up, we're going to do a little bit of configuration on the Liferay side. We're going to tell Liferay, hey, we have an Elasticsearch server. This is where it is. This is the Elasticsearch cluster, and a couple of other tidbits we need to add. And then once we have that, the last step is just to restart Liferay and re-index. So install Elasticsearch, configure Elasticsearch itself, configure Liferay to point to Elasticsearch, and then restart, re-index. Those are going to be our 4 steps. So first part, we have our Liferay instance up and running. And let's say we have Elasticsearch up and running. I'm going to trust you guys that you can go out, download Elasticsearch, unzip and install it. So that's going to be on you. So we're assuming that's already installed. Once it is, you can go ahead and access Elasticsearch hitting localhost :9200. Once you do, it's going to give you some info in a JSON document. Now, kind of a quick tip here, if you're using Firefox, Firefox formats JSON very nicely. But again, it's up to you, it's just preference. So here in the JSON document, once you hit that URL, localhost 9300, you're going to look for the version number. As you can see here in this example, the version number is 6.1.3. So this is just confirming that the Elasticsearch version that you have installed is going to be compatible with Liferay, right? We have specific versions that we need to work with. So confirm the Elasticsearch version. And then after that, you're going to need to do a little bit of configuration and install a couple of plugins. First off, right, download Elasticsearch, extract or install it. You're going to be configuring the Elasticsearch cluster, and then you're going to be configuring some plugins. So we're still in the install and configuration portion, right? Just kind of digging in a little bit more with the install process. So next up, we're going to be naming our Elasticsearch cluster. Now to do so, it's very simple, but beforehand, let's talk about what that looks like. If you come from the sysadmin world, clustering is a very familiar topic. If not, that's okay. The whole idea of a cluster is to have various servers or nodes, as we call them, working together, right? They're going to be sharing information with one another. They're going to be offloading some processes so that way everybody can run efficiently. It's kind of like a hive mind, right? Everybody is kind of trying to work collectively as one. And so while in this example, we're just going to be showing how to configure a one node cluster, if you want some more information on how to configure a whole Elasticsearch cluster, there is Elastic's documentation. To be honest, configuring Elasticsearch clusters are actually really simple. The steps that we're about to take, you just rinse and repeat them, and Elasticsearch for the most part clusters itself. So it's really nice. So first and foremost, we have our Elasticsearch server installed, extracted, and the place that we extract it once you go into that folder is called Elasticsearch Home. So extract it, go into it, and then you're in Elasticsearch Home. Once inside of that home folder, you'll probably see a bunch of other folders. The folder that we are most concerned about in this part is going to be called the config folder. Inside the config folder, you're going to find a file called elasticsearch.yaml. And inside of that YAML file, you're going to find a specific property, cluster name. Now here in cluster name, you can first off uncomment it. And then once you do, you can set up the name of the cluster. So you're basically saying this specific Elasticsearch server or node is going to be pointing to an Elasticsearch cluster. So it's kind of a quote unquote imaginary idea. So that's how you configure the cluster. You just do it again and again for each individual Elasticsearch server, and everybody is pointing to the same place. So that's how you configure an Elasticsearch cluster. Next up, you need to install Elasticsearch plugins. Now back over in Elastic Home, you're going to go into the bin folder and then inside of Elasticsearch plugin. From there, you're going to run a command called install, and you're going to be installing 4 plugins. Again, from earlier, these are the 4 plugins that you're going to be needing. So just run that 4 times, once for each one, and you're on your way. Finally, last step is just starting up Elasticsearch. So you'll need to run this command /Elasticsearch, and after that, Elasticsearch is going to start up. Once it does, keep track of the logs. If you have multiple Elasticsearch servers running, you're going to see each one starting to connect to the cluster. It'll give you some meaningful messages as to what's its status and if it's connecting or not. So one of the things to note for now is going to be this publish address, and more specifically the port number coming at the end. You're going to be needing this a little bit later. So when you're running your own Elasticsearch server, keep those in mind. So we have Elasticsearch installed. We configured the Elasticsearch server to be a part of a cluster, and then we installed the plugins. Next up is configuring Elasticsearch on the Liferay side. So the technical term of this is configuring Liferay's Elasticsearch adapter, right? This is just a fancy way of saying connecting Liferay to Elasticsearch. In order to get to that configuration, you're you're going to head over to the control panel under the configuration section, heading over to system settings, and over in system settings, you'll find search. Once you're there in search, we're going to be looking for Elasticsearch 6. And once you do, you're going to be selecting it and configuring a couple of different properties or configurations. So the first one is pointing Liferay to the Elasticsearch cluster. So in our example, we called the cluster Liferay Elasticsearch cluster, just telling Liferay, hey, this is where Elasticsearch is going to be. The next property we need to set is, how is Elasticsearch running? Are we using the embedded or are we using the remote? So in this example here, we're pointing to a standalone Elasticsearch server, so we're going to be using remote. And then finally, you're going to need that transport address that we saw a couple slides ago. So we enter that address here to let Liferay know this is the address to the Elasticsearch server. Our example was localhost 9300 or 127.0.0.1. Once you have all of those things configured, just go ahead and save. And then finally, last step, we restart Liferay. We then come back into Liferay and re-index. So we saw where that was a little bit ago, right? Just go ahead and follow those and then you're on your way. So this is all kind of under the assumption that we are going to be adopting Elasticsearch. I know a couple of you guys are thinking, hey, I'm on Solar. I've been using Solar since forever. I want to keep on using Solar. And I would say, yeah, that's completely possible. Generally speaking, we at Liferay recommend Elasticsearch, but Solar is still supported. So if we have strong cause, we have strong opinions about our search engines, then by all means, if you want to use Solar, you're more than welcome to. A couple of notes here, right? The version of Solar that we are supporting right now is Solar 7. So keep that in mind. Now, other people, we might be on the fence, right? We have Solar, we have a Solar server, but Elasticsearch kind of seems appealing as well. So when we're dealing with that, we first need to, of course, weigh the pros and cons and kind of decide, how is this going to be impacting us a little bit later. So some of the pros of staying on Solar, you're not going to be changing a lot, right? You already have Solar configured for the most part. Probably the only thing you may need to do is just upgrade. Everything is there, right? It has a very, very excellent pluggable architecture, right? You would know all about it if you're using Solar. But let's talk about Elasticsearch. What are some of the perks of Elasticsearch? Now, if you've taken the DevOps or sysadmin course, then we cover that in much more detail. Let's talk about a couple of quick ones. So it's more scalable. When we're dealing with that Elasticsearch cluster, for example, it's very simple just to plug in more Elasticsearch servers. You want 5? You can get 5. Just point them to the same cluster. You want 10? Sure, point them to the same cluster. Kind of a hyperbole, but you get the idea. Elasticsearch has a very well-developed suite set of applications that they use in order to monitor what's going on. And so they're constantly improving that. They have a lot of investment into their management tools of Elasticsearch. So because of that, it is easier not only to deploy, but also to manage and to monitor what's going on with your Elasticsearch server. That also ties in with the analytics. Again, the people over in Elastic have a lot of tools that they have developed in order to make sure you have a complete picture of what's going on with your Elasticsearch server. So very well thought out, very well developed. And Elasticsearch is what we support out of the box. And so it's very easy to test to see how it works and then stand up your own remote one a little bit later. Now, some of the cons. If we're staying on Solar, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that Solar is not as easily scalable, right? You're following the master-slave sort of paradigm, whereas Elastic is just kind of plug in and then you're part of the hive mind. Along with that, in order to make Solar work, right, you're also going to have to download and install a Solar plugin. Now, generally, that's pretty straightforward, but it is just an extra step that you're going to have to take. What about switching to Elasticsearch? What are some of the downsides? Again, Elasticsearch does require its own infrastructure, however you want to go about it. So you do need to get the hardware or memory needed in order to run it. Because of that, right, there is a little bit more work in getting it up and running. Compared to solar, its plug-in architecture is not as robust. Regardless of that, again, just weigh out your pros and cons, have your discussions with, whomever you need to, and kind of make that decision as a team, right? No matter what I tell you, no matter the pros and cons we talk about, it's ultimately going to be your guys' decision, and you guys will have to live with it, right? For better or for worse. So just kind of depends on where you stand, what the future looks like for you, and other future long-term considerations. So all of that to say, so Liferay supports 2 separate search engines. We got Elastic and Solar. By default, Elasticsearch is what comes out of the box with Liferay DXP, and it comes as an embedded Elasticsearch server for you to test. When you hit production and you want to use Elasticsearch, you're going to have to set up its own sort of environment to get it to work, right? If you're still in the Solar world, you can still use Solar. So that wraps up our discussion about upgrading our search server in regards to infrastructure. I hope this was helpful for you, and I'll see you in the next video.